Hi everybody, hope you're doing fine. Je suis Guy Laforêt, le président de la Fédération des sciences humaines, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here this afternoon for the first Big Thinking Lecture of Congress 2018. I'd like first to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which we gather to hold the 2018 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences is Treaty 4 land and the territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, de même que les terres ancestrales des Métis. We're grateful for the hard work and preparations for the week undertaken by our Congress host and partner for the Big Thinking Lectures, the University of Regina, and we thank them and the Indigenous communities in Regina for welcoming us here. J'aimerais signaler avant de commencer que nous proposons un service d'interprétation simultanée. Vous pourrez vous procurer des écouteurs dans la salle située à l'extérieur du théâtre. I wish to thank our partners, the Humanities and Social Science Research Council of Canada, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, and Universities Canada for their support in organizing the Big Thinking Series. C'est grâce à la générosité de ces partenaires que nous sommes capables, sur une base régulière, d'organiser autant d'événements semblables pour le public, à la fois à Ottawa, dans les communautés et un peu partout à la grandeur du Canada. The Big Thinking Series gives us a chance to engage in thoughtful conversations about pressing issues of our time. Today's no exception. We're delighted to welcome Melina Laboucan-Massimo, who will, no doubt, inspire us all as she discusses how Indigenous peoples, and women in particular, are on the front lines of climate change solutions. I'd now like to invite my friend Vian Timmins, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Regina, to introduce Melina Laboucan-Massimo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy. Welcome, bienvenue to all the scholars and members of the public. Today's a great day to gather at the University of Regina on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional homeland of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis Nation. Congress-themed gathering diversities comes from proximity to the historical gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. All of us are following in that tradition by gathering this week to share knowledge, expertise, and experience. I hope you are enjoying and will enjoy the 2018 Congress. It's our pleasure to host the largest academic gathering in Canada and the largest conference ever held in our beautiful city of Regina. Today, we are hosting the first Big Thinking Lecture of this year's Congress. The idea is to present forward-thinking research addressing critical and pressing questions, and we have a great lineup for the Big Thinking Lecture Series, an all-female lineup this year. First ever for Congress! The theme of this series is Transform, Inspire, Challenge. And today's speaker will do all of these things. And I hope all of you get a chance to read the Globe and Mail article that's on this series, and she is quoted in it. So I'd like to introduce to you Melina Laboucan-Massimo. So Melina is going to stand by me. She's from the... Melina is from the Laboucan Cree community in northern Alberta. She holds a master's degree in Indigenous governance from the University of Victoria with a focus on renewable energy on First Nations communities. She has worked on social, environmental, and climate justice issues for the past 15 years. She has studied and worked in Brazil, Australia, Mexico, and Canada, focusing on resource extraction, media literacy, and Indigenous rights and responsibilities. Her presentation is entitled On the Front Lines, Indigenous Women and Climate Change. She will speak about how Indigenous communities are fighting resource extraction and looking at climate change. She will talk about how these communities are also on the forefront in terms of solutions. Today, we will learn how Indigenous communities are creating clean energy projects and how women in particular are creating climate change solutions that are critical to address the growing impact in our society. This is a great way to begin the series. I am so excited to hear you and to hear the question and answer afterwards. So welcome to Regina, welcome to Congress, and everybody, let's give her a big hand. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. Tansegwakia, nia Melina Laboucan-Massimo, nia Nihiao, kinaskumtanawao. It's an honor and privilege to be here on Treaty 4 territory, home of the Nihiwak, Nikawi, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and homelands of the Michif and Métis peoples. So thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for the Congress for inviting me to be here today to share with you all. I'm going to start actually with a prophecy, and it says, prophecy speaks of a time during the seventh fire when our people will have a choice between two paths. The first path is well-worn and scorched. The second is new and green. It is our choice as communities and as individuals how we will proceed. And so that's actually written, it was written down by Winona LaDuke. It's a prophecy from our elders and our ancestors. But Winona LaDuke is a mentor of mine in Anishinaabe. She's the executive director of Honor the Earth and a Harvard scholar. So here we are. So I'm actually, what I said in Cree, for those of you that don't speak Nihiao, is that my name is Melina Laboucan-Massimo. I'm a member of the Lubicon Cree Nihiao community in Alberta, currently an Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation as well. Just to give you a little bit of background of where I come from in the land that I fight to protect is in the Boreal Forest. So I'm from northern Alberta. That's actually my dad in the top left corner when he was about 5. He was hidden from residential school, so he didn't actually learn English till he was about 10 when they went to the day school. So he's out on my Kokum and Musum. That's my Kokum before she passed away. They actually hid him from residential school. And so when the Indian agent would come into the community, he would be hidden. They would go into the bush onto the trap line. And my dad would talk about how my Muslim would be like, come on, let's go to the trap line. And he'd be like, okay, great, let's go on a trip. And then he'd come back, and then all of the kids and his cousins and his sisters and his brothers were gone. So he had to learn the traditional way, which was a good way in the end, but a lot of sadness and a lot of isolation, not being able to be around children his own age. But he learned from the elders and learned a lot of, so he keeps a lot of stories in our language. And so that's my Kukum, and someone I really respect and admire and look up to. She's passed on now. And we are from the Boreal, which is a beautiful, pristine area that actually holds a lot of carbon, but is actually being deforested currently. It's a beautiful, beautiful area where I'm from. So you can see I was born in the Peace River region. So in the blotchy left spot is the Peace area, and we're about an hour, my family lives in Low Buffalo, about an hour east of there, and as you can see, we're in the Alberta tar sands. So as you can imagine, I think probably a lot of people in this room have heard, but I'll go over a couple of quick summary of some of the impacts. I can't name them all because we could be here all day, but what we think about a lot of is water, especially as women and carriers of water from birth, and we're born into water. So Mackenzie River Basin is a sixth of our freshwater supply in Canada. It's connected to the Peace Athabasca Delta, which flows from glacier-fed systems into the tar sands, into a lot of extraction zones where the water is being pulled out and then also being contaminated. So you can see one of the pristine glacier-fed water systems, the Athabasca Glacier, 1919, 1993. You can see a lot receded, and that's an old picture. I mean, it'd be interesting to go now, and I should go take a picture of it and try to update that photo. But as you can see, my cousin went there a number of years back and said it was super receded. And the woodland caribou by 2040 will be extirpated or locally extinct in our regions because of tar sands extraction and deforestation and fragmentation of the boreal forest, which is known as the lungs of Mother Earth. The lungs of Mother Earth, which really help us fight climate change by staying intact. And then when we deforest and dig up and fragment this beautiful, pristine area. You can imagine we're letting off a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and the muskeg actually carries more GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions, than even where the trees are. So it's a beautiful, I'll talk a little bit more about the muskeg and what happened with our oil spill later, but yeah, it's a beautiful area. I might be biased, but you should come visit. So as you can see here, this is the oil spill that I was referring to. It was one of the biggest ones in Alberta's and Canada's history. It was 4.5 million liters, 28,000 barrels that basically flooded into our traditional territory. My family wasn't informed until 5 days after the spill. So when my auntie, who teaches at the school, was texting me and saying, because she knows the work that I do, she's like, we can't breathe, our eyes are burning, we feel really nauseous, but we're not being informed what's happening. Can you find out? And so I was looking online, and I could only find for the first number of days, like on a business company, like a business oil company website, that one of the pipelines had been shut down because of a spill. And at the time it said a couple hundred barrels, but it was actually 28,000 barrels. So you can see here 15 months later, we went back after the company had said that they remediated and cleaned it up, because I was been monitoring the website. It was actually very difficult to get on to even take pictures and even to take a flyover, because a lot of people didn't want to fly me as a community member in and around, because they didn't want pictures to get out of how big the spill was. And so this is about 15 months later, where we're still digging up goops of basically sludge, toxic sludge, that this was a dead zone. A lot of the elders say, you know, when we used to be able to drink water from the land, when hunters would go out hunting, that it was actually really healthy if you could see all the little insects and bugs like kind of like jumping around the top of the water. But this was just like complete silence, just a dead zone, like just didn't have any life to it. But you could actually see tracks of wolves and different things, different animals around the area. If you want to watch more on this, it's online. It's called Oil on Laboucan Land. It's a YouTube video where you can watch more about what happened, and you know, how pregnant women, small children, elders that have compromised immune systems were not even told to leave the community, which was pretty, for me, probably the most upsetting and most traumatic and traumatizing experience from that, just knowing my family, the impacts, and really not knowing what the long-term impacts would be for our communities, as we don't know as well in that Alberta tar sands what the long-term impacts will be from communities, even though we're already experiencing elevated rates of cancer. So as you can imagine, since we just have a short amount of time, I'll just jump right to it, but what's really happening in a lot of our homelands across Turtle Island is what we saw, what was stated in the TRC, but we've been saying for, you know, Indigenous communities have been saying for a long time, is cultural environmental genocide, where we see a further encroachment on our traditional territories, contamination, destruction of our homelands, which is actually resulting in a loss of culture, traditions, customs, languages. Because as you can imagine, when we pray on the land, that, you know, like, a lot of people see a church as a place of prayer. For us, we see the land as a place of prayer. So when we pray that when you destroy the land and you destroy our homelands, you're destroying the places where we practice ceremony, where we pick medicines for those ceremonies, for all of the things that revolve around our culture, is essentially, it is cultural genocide. And as you can see, what's being replaced is by contaminated, you know, contaminated watersheds, contaminated air, industrialized landscapes. As you can imagine, many of the communities in these regions, this bottom parts were taken from our homelands with the construction of a pipeline, flaring of gas, and that's in the Athabasca, where you cannot pray there. You do not actually want to be there. And I honestly think, because I was there for so long as a climate and energy campaigner with Greenpeace Canada, showing people the impacts, I feel like my immune system's actually compromised from that. And it's hard for me not to get sick now, like I am getting over something today. So if I cough, don't mind me. But just as you can imagine, the population of Indigenous peoples around the world, this is what I've just showed you, is a microcosm of the macrocosm of what we see happening across the world. With Indigenous peoples in over 90 countries, we see this happening really day in and day out, and a lot of times that increased violence for Indigenous peoples that are trying to protect their homelands, protect the medicines, protect the ceremonies. So it's a scary state of affairs. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Indigenous peoples actually guard 80% of what's left of the Earth's biodiversity. So, it is so necessary for us to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples across the world, because our fate is tied up with theirs. Our fate is tied up with all of us, because when we are seeing our homelands destroyed, we are in fact, exacerbating climate change. So it is vital that, our communities are, at the front line of solutions as well, which I'm going to be talking about next. But yeah, women are also, in all of this, are also the first and foremost to be impacted by climate change. So as you can imagine, Indigenous women are even more impacted because of these types of impacts that we're seeing on the ground in a lot of these communities on the front lines. One of the comparisons analysis that I see a lot more out there, I've been talking about a lot since my sister passed away, but violence against the earth is violence against women. And, it's a lot of these undoings where we see women being profiled now in these big ideas lecture series, where women, we're starting to see a shift from, just very patriarchal colonial values to more of an equitable place of being in the society that we all live in, and I hope that we see that across the board. But when we exploit the land, we exploit women, and so we definitely see this playing out a lot in communities with patriarchy and capitalism. I think it's no surprise for probably most of the people in this room and the people that are watching online that we have an epidemic here in Canada of murdered and missing Indigenous women, up to 4,000. My sister Bella is the one on the left there who was found dead in Toronto after she finished her college degree in Toronto. And her case is still unsolved, and we're still looking for justice for her life. This is her actually. She was becoming a knowledge carrier for our family and our community. She was learning how to make hides and pick the medicines and make all of the beautiful things that our aunties and our cookums and our grandmothers had made from, the ones that my cookum would make. She'd make us moccasins and mucklucks growing up. So that's just what Bella was learning, and what she had graduated from was a fashion arts degree, which basically combined traditional arts with contemporary modern fashion. So she was looking at merging those two, but very based in our culture and who we are. As Indigenous peoples, in Nihiawak people in Alberta. I guess the other point is, just when, like I was saying earlier, with practicing our culture on the land, when it's very connected to Mother Earth, Indigenous peoples call the earth our mother, and, that's why I say in this slide that it's no coincidence that our women are dying, just like the land is truly dying right now, unless we actually implement the climate solutions that we really need to see. So our communities are really protecting the land and protecting our women. There's a couple points I want to make before I start showing you some solar presentation. Is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which actually the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is upheld in this as a piece of international legislation, of which Canada is a signatory of. Actually, in the TRC in the 94 recommendations, I counted that the UN DRIP was named at least 22 times as a signatory. And as you probably know, in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in Article 32, it talks about free, prior, and informed consent, which is outlined, which means in international law that Indigenous communities should be informed prior to resource extraction taking place into our homelands, which doesn't happen often enough, and that we should actually have the ability to say no, which actually rarely happens sometimes, which is really a problem that we see in the tar sands and other places in Turtle Island. So sometimes that's why I question, what are the protected rights in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution? This is where the rights of Indigenous peoples are protected, quote unquote. And this is, the rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, it's explicitly under Section 35. And so One of the things is when people talk about has colonialism ended, I indeed say no, it's not. It's continuing on in a form of neocolonialism, especially in forms of resource extraction, which are contributing to climate change. So transitioning over to what does a just transition look like in our communities? This needs to happen not only in communities that can afford renewable energy technology, but it needs to happen in communities that are facing the brunt of environmental, social, health implications. The ones that are on the brunt of environmental degradation and climate change are actually need to be on the front of solutions as well, climate solutions. From an Indigenous perspective, our Indigenous worldview and philosophy, our cosmovision, is renewable energy is much more in alignment with our way of being and thinking, as opposed to resource extraction, which is much more extractive. Renewable energy, we would like to think, is more regenerative, and I feel like it's getting better more and more throughout the years. And we talk about this reciprocity, and I think that's why we see so many Indigenous communities taking up renewable energy in our communities. I don't think a lot of people actually realize that there's over 1,100 small-scale solar projects in Indigenous communities across Canada, and 150 large-scale renewable energy projects across Canada in Indigenous communities. So this is happening. We're already doing this. So it's pretty exciting to be a part of that push. They call returning to zero waste communities, what our communities have always said, living off the land. And also bringing about renewable energy technology. For me, solar was something that made a lot of sense. I was born in the morning. My middle name is Miawapan, which means like nice morning, beautiful morning sunrise. So I was born at the time when the dawn came up. And that's what I was named. So it made a lot of sense for me to really, when the oil spill happened, I was like, what is something tangible I can do? I can talk all I want. I can travel internationally all I want. But if this is still what's happening in my community, then that's not good enough. It's not good enough, because I really want to see the solutions. I want to see what is next for our communities. And so for me, it was looking into what does solar look like in the tar sands. And this is Carlton. He was 21 at the time. We trained him from the start to finish. This is actually the first time ever we had solar panels come into our community. I was very happy to see that. I've never really knew what it was like to cry tears of joy until I started putting up a solar project, which is kind of hilarious, but it's true. So you can see us here. We basically built it all with local hands. Well, so like not everyone from the community, but people that wanted to come work on the solar project could. They were either youth, like I showed Carlton. We had Daryl, Shane, who was 18 at the time. Daryl was 19, and then also we had our older people that were like tradespeople that really brought a lot of knowledge to this project. You can see at top of Pull Mount System because it's right beside the school. The school is just to the right behind there, and then we're actually grid connected into the health center. So the health center was just a new building that was built the year before that brought in new services for the community, and I thought it makes a lot of sense to connect to the health center, and luckily we could. And so you can see they're pretty far up, and a lot of people are like, why would you put it so far up? Why don't you just put it on the ground and then you can just fence it in? And I was like, I don't want to fence solar off from our community, but I also don't want kids to climb over those fences and slide down the solar project because it's a very, very high voltage area. So of course, people can now just walk, all the grass has grown back over and people can now walk around and see it, just look up at it. So that's the final solar installation. And we had a solar launch, a solar feast, where we invited the community to come and, had a ribbon cutting ceremony. And we have all the youth here that, are from 5 till various different ages that they'll see this project when they're 30, and they'll still see the project basically powering our community still. And I would still want to see more solar into our community, so this is kind of the first step into, I think, a long-term project. I work on community energy planning with my nation. So you can see there we did a little drone shot of the ribbon cutting ceremony. Some of the stuff that I'm doing specifically, and I know a lot of other Indigenous women that inspire me too, are working on, but this is what I'm working on with my fellowship, is actually researching renewable energy models in Indigenous communities. So this is us doing energy literacy workshop in lessons in my community in Low Buffalo School with the youth, just bringing energy literacy to our communities. I think one of the reasons why we are facing a climate crisis is because we don't have energy literacy in any of our communities. I think it's seen as a very, very limited, specified, specialized thing that only energy experts should have. But I really feel that all people should have this type of knowledge, because they would be making better choices of what they drive, to whether they turn off their lights, or what the projects are, if they want to become a solar electrician, all of the different things that people, I think, if they had energy literacy, we would be in a very different place right now. Also exploring the connections that exist between Indigenous knowledge and climate science, I think is, what we see is a lot of climate science now coming to terms with what our communities have always been saying. So I think really what the future looks like for us is self-determination, energy sovereignty, food security, healing the land, and healing ourselves. I'm also working on developing progressive renewable energy policy, and currently sit on the Indigenous Electrical Technical Working Group, which engages the Alberta government on pushing for better environmental policy, but actually renewable energy policy, specifically in ensuring that there's inclusion, equity, and participation and ownership of renewable energy projects in Indigenous communities. One last thing that I'll mention too is I'm actually in the process of shooting a TV show on renewable energy, food security, and eco-housing in Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. This was from our trailer. We're actually interviewing one of the people that really inspired me to make this shift in my community, because it's what he's done in his community. Chief Planis from Souk First Nation in Vancouver Island, actually, which is like one of the, more rainy than other places, but they've have one of the biggest solar projects. Now it's probably not as big as it used to be, because it's, he's had it up for many years in the community, but they have oyster farming, they have electric vehicles in their communities, they have wasabi greenhouses and community farming, so it's pretty amazing to see how far ahead they are. And also fundraising and implementing more renewable energy projects like Laboucan Solar. So I'm going to show you a quick video to end for the solar project back home. And this is another video that you can watch of a second project that I fundraised for and helped put up with the Tiny House Warriors. This on Facebook, so you look up either Laboucan Solar, Tiny House Warriors. Laboucan Solar will have the video near the top, so you can check out what we've done to solarize communities in the path of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And here, so now I'll just switch it over to the video, and I hope you enjoy. It's really quick and short.
The Laboucan Cree have been here since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples have a very intimate connection with our homelands here in northern Alberta. And what we've seen instead is industry coming and essentially taking over our lands and really exploiting them, and it's had a detrimental impact. We see companies digging down into the earth, trying to extract the very last drop of oil. But instead, we can start looking up. We're bathing in sunlight all around us, and yet we don't utilize that energy. And so that's why our community has decided to install solar. Pretty amazing to see this project go up. A lot of the community members and the young people are working, they're getting hands-on training right now. It's really amazing to see how proud people are of it and how it's a community project, because all of this has been through the blood, sweat, and tears of the community.
Well, this project matters to us because it kind of represents who we are and where we're going in the future. When you see the work, I can say that I did that. I took part and I did it right. So there'll be a lot of people seeing it every day. I can tell people I worked on this.
I know in a lot of the ceremonies and the songs, the sun is praised. Even the project name, Bita Pan, means the coming of the dawn, and it's coming of a new era, era where we use, energy that's not devastating to our environment. In getting this solar project going, we are leaders in solar power, and that's what we're teaching our youth. They have to learn how to operate it, they have to learn how to maintain it, and they already know how to set it up. So if any of our neighbors in the surrounding First Nations or Métis settlements want to start a solar power, we can be there to help them get it going.
So, hi, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Melina, for your compelling lecture. I'm absolutely convinced that everybody has enjoyed this. So let me tell you how we will work with the Q&A. I invite questions from the audience in the time remaining. Please give us your names, use the mics, and introduce yourselves, therefore, before asking a question. Vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais ou en français, and Melina will be able to answer. So there are mics circulating, so please identify yourself and ask a question. Madam.
Hello, I'm Anne Dyer-Witherford from Ontario. Very interesting, these activities you're involved in. But I think something you said earlier at a higher level deserves some scrutiny. You made the statement that, you said a very interesting thing there, 370,000 Indigenous people in the world, I believe that was
370
million, and they guard 80% of the world's land. And of course, 370 million is actually a small percentage of the world's population.
It is.
And 80% is a high percentage of the land. Mm-hmm. So the suggestion that that they are successfully guarding this population, this whole extent of the world's land, would that it were true, but you also said it's very weak. The Native people are essentially politically weak, so they are working, when you have a small percentage of the population supporting the world's, a large percentage of the resources, obviously you've got a little bit of a problem there. So I wanted to know what you meant by guard, because would intend to guard have a natural affinity, a natural ability to do so, geographical situation to do so? What do you think, and what is lacking in that ability to guard, if that is what you believe
Well, I think
the native role is?
Sure. I think multinational corporations really take over a lot of homeland, so I wouldn't say that it's potentially depending on what happens in the course of history, which is currently what we're facing right now, is a climate crisis. If we don't help Indigenous peoples around the world to guard that biodiversity, then I think that we're going to be faced with very dire results. So this is actually from international organizations that I can send you the sources for, but it's not something that I'm making up out of my head. It's actually very well-known stats. So 80% of the biodiversity, as you can imagine, most people live in cities. So a lot of humanity lives in cities. A lot of Indigenous peoples do not. They actually live out in rural communities like my family. So even though there's not a lot of us, we are actually surrounded by our homelands that we utilize a lot of that biodiversity for in a very reciprocal way. So I wouldn't say that we're not successful in inhabiting our homelands. I think, it's no coincidence that Canada was found in a very pristine condition because Indigenous peoples utilized Canada for time immemorial for thousands and thousands of years. It was in a very good condition before a lot of settlers came. So therefore, when a lot of people come that aren't necessarily connected to the land and start kind of pillaging and not necessarily caretaking for the land, I think a lot of destruction is going to happen, which is what we've seen in 150 years of Canada. So that's what I mean by, and that's what these international organizations also mean by that Indigenous peoples guard or essentially inhabit 80% of the biodiversity in the world.
Again, you are most welcome to go to the mics for questions. I will ask Melina one. The Congress is of the Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences. We meet teachers, we meet students. I'd like to ask you, in your own personal evolution, has there been one moment, one pedagogical experience that was so significant that you would consider it as a turning point? And if there's something like that, could you share it with us?
A turning point. I feel like I've had a lot of different parts to this puzzle of why I do the work that I do. I would say 1988 was when our community was guarding our homelands, where I was 7 years old, and I was on the front lines where our community was blocking oil companies from coming into our territories. The Laboucan is internationally known for doing that. That was a big thing for me as a part of the history that I was born into. And I would say actually when I moved to the cities, when my mom wanted to do her master's degree in psychology, she wanted to move to Edmonton, so that was the closest city. And when I got to Edmonton, I was shocked. I was like, how do people have so much wealth here? And when in our communities where we're surrounded by a lot of natural wealth, there's so much poverty. And why is there such a discrepancy between the wealth of rural communities and urban communities, even though a lot of the wealth is taken from the communities that live in where the wealth comes from, especially in Alberta? So for me, that was a big turning point as well. And then when I did the first part of my master's, what really struck me and struck a chord was when I started uncovering a lot of the research around the tar sands. Everyone just called it the rigs growing up. People just said, oh, I'm gonna go work in the rigs, or they didn't talk about the tar sands and bitumen and all these technical terms. And so when I started doing my research in environmental studies at York, I realized, oh my gosh, why don't I know this? I live here. Why doesn't my family know this? Why doesn't the community next door to us know this? Why don't people I went to high school with or junior high with, or, so that was really shocking, of just uncovering a lot of research, that how do I actually take that and break it down to make it intelligible for people that actually want to listen to it, that aren't going to read these research papers, but are still interested about clean air, clean water, and all of the things that I think we all care about in this room.
Madam? Sorry for that, accept the apologies of the Federation.
Everybody in the Federation is very tall. My name is Marsha Brondy. I'm a PhD graduate of University of British Columbia. But in 1972, I got probably one of the first degrees in the United States in environmental education. And so your talk has been wonderfully inspiring to me, and I was with you in my heart. I wanted to both support you and respond to the previous speaker because on March 10th, I climbed Burnaby Mountain with the local police said 5,000 and the Globe and Mail said 10,000 people who were of every ethnicity, every background, every indigeneity. They were First Nations people from the tar sands, from the coast of British Columbia, from the Six Nations Reserve, and they were elders, and we were all there to stand to protect the land. And it was, talk about your moving experience, it was certainly that for me. And I think that's what needs to be said, is it's not just the First Nations. The First Nations have been holding this land for us for many, many years, but it is up to all of the rest of us to wake up, smell the coffee and the oil that is taking these resources from our land, and stand clearly with the Indigenous people who are doing such work. Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you.
Would you want to address the comment?
I was there too. I was there on March 10th. I have a close relationship with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which actually has a court case against the Kinder Morgan pipeline, so close to the George family, and was up on the stage, so I guess maybe you saw me there, with two other women that I've worked closely with throughout the years, Ariel Deranger from the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, and Jesse Cardinal, Keepers of the Water, and his Métis, and myself. So yeah, thank you for coming and showing the support. It was a pretty epic day. And the same thing, I agree, there was grandmothers, children, elders from all walks of life, all backgrounds, ethnicities, Indigenous people led, but also so many people that stand with us. And that's really what I did mean in the slide was, we do inhibit and guard 80% of the biodiversity, but we need people to stand with us to ensure that when I just read this morning another Indigenous woman was shot in the back of the head from Guatemala. And I just think that there's Indigenous women like us that are standing to protect their homelands, to protect that biodiversity, but violence is being enacted with so many women. I've also met and visited in the Sariaku Indigenous women there and stayed with their families in the Amazon rainforest that are protecting in Ecuador their homelands, and they get death threats. So, there's these things that are happening, so it's really important for us to not only stand with Indigenous peoples in the north, but also in the south. So, hi, thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. My name's Gabriel Miller. I'm with the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences. Since joining the Federation, it seems to me that people in higher education, many people are taking to heart the messages from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the need for change in education. I just wanted to know how you feel about the progress that is being made there, and whether you have any words of wisdom or advice for people who work in our universities across Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's the first step in the right direction. The first step always is admitting a wrong, admitting the harm that's been caused by the state on behalf, for people. So I think it's a first step, but it's a long journey for many people. I think it's not just an apology, it's a reconciliation. It's also both sides. It's not just one-sided, so it needs to be heard, and the dialogue needs to happen between all the people that are involved in the situation. For me, as a young Indigenous person growing up, I felt very invisibilized by the educational system. So I think it's really great that the TRC named education as fundamental, and I do see some ways that in universities and even high schools are including the history, the real history for all Canadian people to understand what history that they've inherited, because it was just kept out so much out of the history books for so long, and I think that's why there's a huge gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I feel like that can be remedied by really speaking the truths, the hard truths that make people feel uncomfortable, but people have to come to terms with. And it's not about shame, it's not about blame, but it's about owning the responsibility of what it means to be Canadian. So I think that it's really important for the universities to incorporate this type of information and knowledge from Indigenous communities in their curriculum and in supporting Indigenous students as well. I think for myself, I was 1 out of 1,000 out of 30,000 Indigenous peoples at the University of Alberta when I did my first degree, and it felt very isolating. I would literally walk around campus by myself and just would look for other people that maybe somehow resembled me, and I had some friends, but it was a very isolating experience, and I'm happy that I finished, but I would go to the Native Student Services and just kind of hang out there and see if I could meet any other students, and would go just talk to the advisors, which were really helpful at the time, that were Indigenous peoples from our community, so it was easy for me to talk to them. So I'd say really having, really fostering those types of environments for Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples that are coming from afar. I was able to come in and out of the city growing up, so I had a better understanding, but I couldn't imagine what it would be like coming from a very isolated community and that being my first experience, because that was overwhelming in itself. Hi, thank you.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hi there, thanks for that talk. That's wonderful. Brett Dalter, I'm a postdoc here at University of Regina, and wanted to ask you your thoughts on the role of the university in this energy transition. So we have here in Saskatchewan, on campus, we have a petroleum research center, and we have a clean coal research center, and at the University of Saskatchewan, we have a nuclear research center. But here in Saskatchewan, we have wonderful wind resource and the best solar resource in Canada. We don't have a solar or a wind research center. Have you seen examples of how renewables are being researched and brought forward in universities across Canada or North America or the world?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I would hope that in the future, because of the high potential of solar and wind in Saskatchewan, it's a no-brainer. You would really think that this would have research. There's so much potential and capacity, so I really, really do hope to see that in the future. But it was actually a really big struggle for me to find that, to finish my master's degree in renewable energy. It was very hard to find these types of programming in universities, especially at that level. There was more like the trades, which is even still slow in coming. When I talk to a lot of workers, it's very slow. There's like NATE and SATE in Alberta that are bringing online solar and technology training, but it's very, very limited. So I haven't actually seen it. I actually haven't done as much research as I did when I went to do. So I did my master's and I entered over 6 years ago when I did the entrance. So I'd say that there's probably more programming now, but I would say that there needs to be more, and that's something that we actually even talked to the Alberta government about training and transitioning workers and what a just transition looks like for not only Indigenous communities, but also for workers and for people that want to really excel in this field. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Mon nom est Samuel Gagnon, je suis un étudiant à la maîtrise en éducation. J'aimerais vous remercier pour la présentation, puis aussi dire que je vais poser ma question en français parce que je suis trop nerveux pour faire une traduction live.
Thanks.
We'll take care of that.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. En écoutant votre présentation, j'ai trouvé que c'était important à l'école primaire de développer une pensée critique, la littérature scientifique, et comme vous l'avez mentionné aussi, la energy literacy, et ce, dès le début du primaire. Maintenant, votre communauté a déjà un attachement à la terre, et aussi vous avez eu la chance d'avoir le beau projet où vous avez installé des panneaux solaires dans la communauté pour conscientiser et les jeunes pour ensuite faire en sorte qu'il y ait un engagement. Maintenant, que pensez-vous qu'est le rôle de l'école primaire dans d'autres communautés, par exemple dans des milieux urbains, pour cette energy literacy-là? Et aussi, brièvement, que feriez-vous avec les jeunes qui vivent dans ces milieux urbains-là pour les conscientiser et faire en sorte que ceci mène à un engagement? Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Short question. That's great.
Yeah, I tried.
Do you have a translation?
There's
I
energy
understood.
literacy naturally in communities like the ones in which you were raised. However, in urban areas, it might be tougher. So how do we bring that kind of energy literacy in primary education, in urban centers, and things like that?
Okay. I mean, I think it's introducing it into kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the truth and reconciliation. I'm so sorry, I can't speak in French.
Oh, that's fine.
With the truth and reconciliation, bringing this type of knowledge into classrooms earlier so people understand it from an earlier age. For example, I think there really is no difference between my community and a community in the center in terms of how we would teach it. So say, for example, I'll give you an example from what we did back home and how that could be easily used in urban center. So when we put up the solar project, and there's many solar projects in urban centers as well, so utilizing that as a case study, where when we put up the solar project, I went back into the community in the fall, and the grade 5s, like they were grade 5 and 6, they literally just wanted to ask questions for like a half an hour. Like I didn't even have to like bait them or anything, just like talk to them. They're like, what happens when the sun doesn't shine? Like, okay, well, do you turn it off? Or like, how do you like all these questions, you could tell that from the beginning of August when we put the project up till September, October, they had been like really ruminating on this, like really thinking about like, what is solar? What does it mean for a community? Why is it here? What does it do? Like, so I feel like when you have examples, whether it be urban or rural, that really inspire young people to really take notice and see it actually working. Because I think for too long, for the past 30 years, 40 years now, like solar panels have existed, and we think, oh, that's such a great novel idea. And but really, like if we had put these up in the 80s and the 70s, I know there was some small ones, definitely, but I would say, and the technology just gets better and better and the price goes down and like the clean tech sector is just booming. So I think that there is just so many case studies to utilize in rural and urban centers. Say, for instance, the city of Banff is basically, I met some of the councillors there and they're like working towards like net positive or net zero, or like where they're actually solarizing all of their rooftops, and they have like one of the few feed-in tariff systems internally, not within Alberta or BC, but it's like an internalized feed-in tariff system that actually helps community members to put solar on their rooftop. So it's very much an example that I think that we can take note that we can utilize and use as energy literacy. Should be just like, how do we use our credit cards? That should be in our schools as well. Like, so energy literacy, how to use our credit cards, the truth and reconciliation, all the things that are important for Canadians to really understand each other and be successful in the future.
Merci beaucoup, thank you.
Not going to debt more, I mean, yeah.
Yes.
Say just,
Madame.
Melina, thank you. Welcome to the territory and to the homelands of the Métis. I'm Margaret Kress. I work at the University of New Brunswick, but this is my home. And I've worked with probably many elders and also those that know David Suzuki and the work that you're doing now. And one of the elders that I've worked with is Elder Marie Adam from Fort McMurray, and I'm sure you may have, you know her because you work with Ariel and other people there. So I have been working in this area of environmental destruction, racism, eco-justice with Indigenous women for a decade or more now, across the nation and across the world in different places. And so one of the things that I'm interested in, and also I've done a lot of work in the issues of bringing a public awareness campaign to Canadians around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So I've worked in Saskatchewan and in New Brunswick, and we brought a very large campaign to the University of New Brunswick called the Red Shawl Campaign. But one of the things that I'm most interested in, and hearing about what you're doing here at home, in Alberta, in the prairies, in Canada, throughout North America, Turtle Island, but also throughout the world, because you make comment about Central America and South America and the kinds of things that are going on there, of which Canadians partake in. We have miners in all of these places. doing some things that are very, destructive to Indigenous peoples. So my question is, and my concern and my need to know is, how is it that we as Indigenous people and allies are going to bring the voice of women and girls, all ages of women and girls from these communities together to make a collective statement here in Canada, but beyond that? How are we going to do that? How are we going to help young children in schools? How are we going to engage university programs in this understanding of environmental racism and the impacts that it has, and genocide, and the impacts it has on Indigenous peoples and what it is doing to the Earth Mother? So what are your ideas about the collective of women, and how should we go about doing this?
That's a big question.
And the answer has to be short.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, then there you go. I'm sorry for short. I mean, I think there's a multi-pronged approach. I don't think that there's ever going to be one way to solve environmental racism, the climate crisis, violence against women. I think that there's many levels and layers that need to take place. And as a woman collective, I agree that I think the more that we can work together as women, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that we make a better and stronger front. And I would say there's actually, I'm a part of an international women's treaty that talks about this actually and has it laid out. I can send it to you if you want, but where a lot of these women defenders that are on the lands throughout the Americas have signed on to it. So I think that's one thing to show that we're standing in solidarity with one another. But I think it is about the multi-pronged thing of starting at early ages of putting this type of information in curriculum, age dependent on, the sensitivity and the harshness of the reality of the situation. But it needs to start at younger ages. I think we're really failing, what I've seen, when I finished my first degree, and one of my friends was like, I learned about this in university. How is this even possible? So if you're not in university, that means that you're not learning about our own collective history here in Canada. And I think, that's why it needs to start a lot younger, not just in universities. So maybe it's also universities helping share curriculum with high schools. But I feel like that's being developed in high schools, but I feel like it even needs to go younger. So, I definitely can't really answer the question in this because I have limited time, but I think that working in collectives and sharing the knowledge and working in solidarity and with numbers, I feel like even with this big ideas series, the fact that it's all women, I think it just shows, I wish I could meet all the women in the lectures, but I think it shows that there is a rising of Indigenous women in really around the world, but especially here in Turtle Island, that people are taking notice of, but also need support for. So, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. The humanities and the social sciences are about hope and optimism for the future. So on behalf of the Federation, the University of Regina, out of all of us, we wish to thank you for the thoughtfulness and the quality of the exchange with the public today. I'll go to I need to hold the mic, so this is a technical redress of the situation. So accept that gift on behalf of the Federation. I'm okay. I don't need help. I also wish to thank the University of Regina, our host, co-host with the Federation for Congress 2018 and for this Big Thinking series. J'espère vous voir demain lors de la deuxième des causeries voire grandes de notre congrès 2018. Tomorrow's Big Thinking lecture features Dr. Margaret Macmillan, Professor of History at the University of Toronto, former Warden of St. Anthony's College and Professor of International History at Oxford. She'll be reflecting on the tangled history of war and society and our complicated feelings towards it and towards those who fight. The event will take place in English with simultaneous translation available and is again here at the University Theatre at 12:15. I want you to remember that all our Big Thinking events are videotaped. I invite you to view the lectures later on our Congress website, de sorte que l'espoir, hope, will live not only now, but in coming weeks and months. Merci à toutes et tous dans l'auditoire. Je vous souhaite une excellente journée. Have a great day and enjoy Congress 2018 at the University of Regina. Merci.